Jesus said, "Man cannot live on bread alone, but from every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." You're listening to Daily Truth.
It's important that we remember that the problem with Judaism today, as we find it, and I think that our text is saying you are already starting to see the beginnings of this concept that I'm about to espouse. But the problem with it today is not that it's half of the Christian religion. There's a lot of evangelical Christians, I think, that operate underneath that presupposition. And we just haven't been properly or thoroughly educated about Judaism. We just don't understand. We think the problem with Judaism is it's the Old Testament minus the New, right? That it's half of the Bible, or if we're saying literal counting word count, then it's 2/3 of the Bible, give or take. But the problem is it just doesn't include the New Testament, and with that, the biggest problem is it doesn't include Christ. They don't see Christ as the Messiah, that they're still waiting for some other Messiah, that they think Jesus wasn't it. And that's a big problem. Now, if that was the only problem with Judaism, it would be a significant enough problem to send anyone who prescribes to Judaism to hell. So it's a big that's enough of a problem. Any problem that's sufficient to get you to hell is a big problem. It's a sufficient problem. But Judaism is far worse than that. It's not just, we have the Old and New Testament as Christians, and Jews have the Old Testament. No, the better way to think of it is that we both have the Old Testament, and then we each have two separate, completely contradicting lenses, hermeneutical tools for interpreting that Old Testament. So the Christian has the Old Testament, and then we have the New Testament. We read the Old in light of the New. One theologian once said that the Old Testament is like a richly furnished room, but it's dimly lit. And only in the light of Christ, primarily as Christ is in the Old Testament, but Christ clearly espoused by the apostles in the New, do we have the light then shed in this Old Testament richly furnished room where we can actually appreciate what's there. That I can appreciate this beautiful room in the light of the New Testament. For the Jew, it's not just they only have the Old Testament or missing the New. They have the Torah, Old Testament, and the Talmud. The Talmud is their hermeneutical tool for interpreting the teachings found in the Torah. So just like we read the Old Testament in light of the New Testament, they read the teachings of Moses, what's actually in the Old Testament, that actually is the inspired, breathed out word of God. They read that, but in light of the Talmud, which is in light of certain interpretations and exegesis and certain rituals and certain traditions by modern Jewish rabbis since the writers of the Old Testament who got it entirely wrong. Got it entirely wrong. So it's not just, hey, it's incomplete. They have the truth, but just incomplete truth. No, we both share the truth of the Old Testament, and then theirs has been thoroughly perverted and twisted and dismantled. And ours has been fleshed out. The truth that was always there about Christ, all the types, all the shadows, pointing towards the Messiah, but now clearly revealed in the writing of the New Testament by the apostles, commissioned by Christ himself. That's the difference. And so what we see in Judaism still to this day is not just diverse teachings, all the requirements of the ceremonial laws, right? That if you're on an elevator and it's the Sabbath and you're in Israel, right? It's not going to work because it lights, you push that button and it's going to light a small little spark, and that's lighting a fire, and that's working on the Sabbath, right? And so what happens on the Sabbath, on Saturday, if you're in Israel, the elevators stop on every floor. And it's automatically programmed so that nobody has to break the Sabbath by pushing that button, right? So you've got the diverse teachings, right? And that's the same way, for the record, that the Pharisees and Sadducees were starting to misinterpret the Sabbath even at the time of Christ, 2,000 years ago, right? That some of his disciples, they were plucking heads of grain as they were walking with Jesus and eating the grain. And the Pharisees complain and say, your disciples are doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath. Now, do you know why that's not lawful? Because, you could take something off of a plate and do the physical motion with your hand of taking food and putting it in your mouth on the Sabbath. But the reason why plucking a head of grain was not permitted on the Sabbath is because that constituted harvesting. You're harvesting. Did you know that on the Sabbath, at the time of Jesus, they had determined that you could pick up a chair in your home and you could walk with it a certain distance, right? So the man who Jesus healed, and he says, take up your mat and go home. Well, he went too far, right? So that was breaking the Sabbath. He was carrying his mat too far. But you could, on the Sabbath, according to the Pharisees and scribes and religious rulers, you could pick up a chair in your house and go a short distance and move it. But you couldn't drag the chair. Why could you not drag it? That's literally less energy being exerted. So it actually would be less work. Seems counterintuitive. But the reason why you couldn't drag it is because if you dragged a chair on the ground with dirt floors, it would pierce the surface of the ground, and that would be plowing. Right? So you can't harvest and you can't plow. Now Jesus comes and says, hey, forget the Sabbath. No. That's where the evangelicals are wrong. 98% of them. But no, he doesn't say forget the Sabbath. He says, I'm Lord of the Sabbath. I'm Lord of the Sabbath, which means I get to decide how the Sabbath works. You don't tell me how me and my disciples should observe the Sabbath. I'll tell you. I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. And the Sabbath, he goes on to say, man was not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath was made for man. In other words, Jesus is saying, it's not as though God created the Sabbath on the sixth day and then man on the seventh and said, I made this holy day on the sixth day, and now I've got to create image-bearing creatures because somebody's got to observe it. I made this special day. The day is what really counts. And now I need to make, just little peons to pay credence, proper credence to my special day. No, God created man on the sixth day, and he created the Sabbath for man on the seventh. The Sabbath is not a day of rest because God was weary. That's blasphemy. That's heresy. He is the Lord. He does not grow weary, nor does he grow tired. God does not rest on the seventh day and bless it and make it holy because he just worked so hard on the first 6 days that he was out of breath. That's not what takes place. God rests, as it were. We should understand that analogically. But God rests, as it were, on the seventh day to set a pattern and an example for his finite. God, who is infinite, needs no rest, but he sets an example for his finite creatures so that we might imitate his example and find the rest that he doesn't need, but we do. The Sabbath is actually a gracious gift of God to man. And Jesus is reminding the religious rulers of his day who already, they weren't just weighing the people down with diverse doctrines, meaning a bunch of doctrines, but that actually were technically true within the ceremonial law category of the Old Covenant. No, they were wearing people down with strange doctrines, aka certain interpretations of the ceremonial law that really did come from God, but them twisting it and tweaking it to where they could uphold it, but everybody else couldn't.